Dear colleagues, dear friends, it's time to start. Tonight, Professor Otávio Bueno will deliver his first lecture about modal epistemology. And first, I take the honor, give a very short introduction to him. This is Professor Otávio Bueno. I don't know how to pronounce his basic information. He got his PhD in 1999 from Leeds University, United Kingdom. His areas of specialty very wide. Philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of logic, philosophical logic, epistemology and metaphysics, philosophy of arts cover very widely. Areas of competence, logic. Right now, his academic composition. He works at the Department of Philosophy, University of Miami. Over there, I stayed 1 year with Professor Zhang in 2002 to 2003. Right now, Professor Otávio Bueno is a professor since 2006. He's the chair of the department since 2011. He is also Cooper Senior Scholar in Arts and Sciences since 2018. He is currently the editor-in-chief of Syntax and the Syntax Library book series. Syntax is very important and influential journal of philosophy. He is the co-author or co-editor of many books, including Applying Mathematics, Encoding, Inference, Interpretation, Oxford, OUP, 2018. This is Modal epistemology, where comes on at Routledge. The Routledge Handbook of Modality, a companion to Latin American philosophy, yes, and many others. He has published over 200 articles in journals and collections. His work appeared in journals such as Loose, Mind, British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, Philosophical Studies, Philosophy of Science, Syntax, Journals of Philosophical Logic, Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Analysis, Attentiveness, Mindlist, Metaphilosophy, many others. Really, some of them are top journal of philosophy. Some of them very good journal of philosophy. He has given over 600 talks worldwide. So last year, he has been elected as a full member of International Academy of the philosophy of science appears the list. His name is in the list. So you can tell he's very active, energetic, productive in the wide fields of philosophy. He will deliver 2 online lectures about modal epistemology, invited by School of Philosophy, Wuhan University. The first lecture, modal and modal knowledge collect. The second, necessity and contingency, quantum mechanics and empiricist modality. Let's Thursday night, the same time. Okay. Frankly speaking, I have not yet read much of Professor's Otávio publications. Maybe from this talk, I will read some of his publications. Yeah, by the way, I mentioned Professor Otávio once attended international conference on modality, logic, and philosophy, organized by myself at PK University in 2019. You see, he stands in the middle of the first line. Okay. Yes. Tonight, we have a commentator. He is Professor Zhang Lifeng. Actually, he is my former PhD student at PK University. He do a lot of research about the metaphysics of and epistemology of modality. He published several Chinese books. The first, From the Viewpoints of Modality. The second, Modality and Essence. The third, Analytical Philosophy of Religion. He is maybe Fischer, the Chinese translation of Timothy Williamson's book, Modal Logic and Metaphysics, were published by Nanjing University Press. Okay. Now the time for Professor Otávio's lecture. Please and welcome. Okay. Okay. You can share your slides.
All right. Okay. Well, first, I'd like to thank Professor Chen for the lovely invitation to speak to you tonight and next week. I really appreciate. I have very fond memories of the time I visited China for the conference. Well, how could we know? It would be soon afterward, everything would be shut down. So it was good that we could come to that event. So the two talks, the one I'm going to give tonight and the one I'll give next week, are connected. They are explorations of modality and the epistemology of modality from a particular point of view, especially from an empiricist point of view. So today I'm going to focus on the roles that models may or may not play in our knowledge of what's possible and what's necessary. So let's start. So one of the questions I want to consider is whether their models themselves can be sources of modal knowledge, right? Or alternatively, do they only encode information that's relevant to obtain and establish the knowledge? So these are two different ways that we can think, right? One is that the modal knowledge comes from the models, or they do not come from the model, but the models just encode information that is actually derived from somewhere else, right? And I want to tonight consider this issue by examining two approaches in the epistemology of modality and the epistemology of models in science. So what I want to see is, since our best sources of knowledge about the world is provided by the sciences, and given the role that these models play in science, I want to examine to what extent models in science can or cannot be sources of modal knowledge for the epistemology of modality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on views that defend that there is actually a very tight connection between scientific models that emphasize modality are features of the models, right? And views that emphasize that models are a source of modal knowledge and justification, right? So on the one hand, we're going to see the work that Fischer has articulated, insisting that modal knowledge and modal justification is a matter of exploring the models, right? And von Frasen, in the scientific image and elsewhere, insists that modality are actually features of the model. This is part of his form of empiricism, right? That insists that there is no real modality in nature. When modality is just a feature of the models we use to represent nature. And on both views, there are different views, and we're going to see the differences. On both views, the conclusion is that modal knowledge emerged from model knowledge, that is, knowledge from models. That models are the source of knowledge and justification about modality. I want to contrast these views and argue that models convey relevant information about the model, about what's possible or necessary, but they themselves are not the sources of modal knowledge. Rather, modal knowledge results from knowledge of the relevant properties of the objects under consideration. And models typically have an auxiliary role of encoding some of the relevant information. So I'm going to, despite being an empiricist, I'm going to resist the form of empiricism that von Frasen defends, where he denies that there are modal properties, that there are real modalities in nature. I actually think that there are modal properties, that our modal knowledge is knowledge of those properties that objects have. And it's because of they have these properties that we can have knowledge of what the modal properties is. And later in the talk, I'm going to suggest how that view, which is a realist view about modality, however, is a perfectly empiricist view nonetheless. So that's the plan for tonight. Next week, I'm going to sort of explore that take, looking at a particular context of a scientific theory like quantum mechanics, and see how the modality emerges very naturally in the quantum context as an illustration of this form of empiricism that I defend, what I call a modalist empiricism. So, but this will become clear as we go. So in this respect, the epistemology of modality, I think, is not significantly different from the epistemology of scientific models. And it's in that it uses models as a useful device to infer information about the relevant objects. But ultimately, one's access to the objects and their properties that provides the proper grounds for modal knowledge, right? So, in a way, this is a fairly reasonable view, right? If you want to know about quantum particles or whales, you want to study the objects and their properties, right? That's how we know what they are, how they behave, what the properties they have. In that sense, modal knowledge should not be different, right? It should be knowledge about the modal properties of those things. And that's what I'm going to be defending, but arguing that that's actually a perfectly legitimate form of empiricist view. Modality is then understood as an objective feature of the objects under consideration, in contrast with von Fraassen's proposal that insists that modality is a feature of the models that represent the objects, not of the objects themselves. And modal knowledge and justification depends neither on inference to the best explanation nor on theoretical virtues, more generally, in contrast with Fischer's view. So in this way, I'm positioning the view I'm defending as different from these two forms of empiricism about modality. So what results is actually a form of empiricist modalism, right? The modalism is something I've been defending with Scott Shalkowski in a number of publications. We have a book forthcoming on the epistemology of modality, and another book on modalism more broadly. And today I'm going to sort of give a particular empiricist twist to this modalism. Scott is on the fence on this, is sympathetic with empiricists, is not quite ready perhaps to fully embrace it, but that's what I'll be doing tonight. Okay, to start, given the prominent role of models in scientific practice, let me identify what I think are four central roles that models play in science. Right? First, they have an information role, right? Models encode information about certain domains of inquiry, right? They often involve some form of idealization, de-idealization, abstraction, or approximation, right? From more theoretical information all the way to empirical data, right? So this is something very salient in scientific practice, right? Models are throughout being used to simplify, structure, and organize some bits of information about a physical domain, whether it's quantum particles, whether it's genetic information, or behavior about cheetahs. Secondly, models play an inferential role, right? They allow us to derive and reinterpret results about an empirical setup, right? I think this is especially the case for mathematical models, right? In fact, Rick Hughes argued for a form of representation in which models, information about the empirical setup is embedded into the models, referred and reinterpreted back into the world. And that general approach, then I developed with my book with Stephen French, the Professor Chen highlighted in his introduction, where we apply this way of thinking about models, highlighting the inferential role the models play in ways of representing the world, particularly, as I said, for mathematical models. Thirdly, models play a mapping role. They connect different domains of inquiry, sometimes in quite unexpected ways, right? But also theory and experimental data, right? This is something that Pat Suppes has emphasized throughout his career. How to sort of have a hierarchy of models, right? That are all embedded or interconnected, mapped one into another, from highly theoretical models all the way down to models of the data and experimental models. So in this way, models play a role of systematizing information by being connected via those mappings with one another. And finally, models have an expressive role, right? They collectively express scientific theories, right? Thought of, according to the semantic approach, as family of models. It's something that von Frasen emphasized, as well as Lacoste in French and many others. So there is you can encode what a theory is, thinking of it as a particular family of models, right? So those are four distinctive roles that explain why models are so important in scientific practice. But also here some concerns. In particular, can models also provide knowledge of the domains they represent? Cannot the model itself be a source of knowledge? That's what I want to resist, right? I think all the four roles I just identified are important and significant, but that doesn't follow that the models themselves are a source of knowledge. Why? Because to provide knowledge, models would need to be true. Since knowledge, however it's characterized, it's at least factive, right? If one knows that P, then P is the case, P is true. That's a basic requirement for any account of knowledge, right? The facticity of knowledge. If you know something, then you can infer that what you know is true. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it, right? It doesn't make sense to say, yes, I know this, but it's false, right? I know it's night in Wuhan now at this moment, but it's false, right? That doesn't make any sense. So sources of knowledge need to be factive in order to guarantee knowledge factivity. For instance, perceptual experiences provide knowledge since such experiences are themselves factive, right? If I see that Pat is in front of me, then Pat is in front of me, right? If I see this computer in front of me, then the computer is. So it's because perceptual experiences are factive that they provide knowledge, that they can be sources of knowledge. Otherwise, they couldn't, right? Imagination is not a source of knowledge because of you can imagine things that are even impossible, right? That doesn't mean that they are true. So it cannot be the source of knowledge, right? Now, memory also provides knowledge since it's similarly factive, right? If I remember that Pat watched last year in Marienbad, then Pat did watch last year in Marienbad. Note that on this view, a false memory is not a memory, right? It's a piece of imagination. So for memory to play an epistemic role, at least the portions of memory that are able to play that role, they need to be factive. But models, at least as used in scientific practice, are not true, right? Some are not even true apt, right? For example, an iconic model, right? If you have a model that is a physical thing, for example, the model of the Bay Bridge, right? Well, it's a little model sort of made of plastic. So it doesn't make sense to say that that model is true, right? It's just a piece of plastic, right? The model itself is not even truth apt to begin with. Other models, for example, Bohr's atomic model, right? The little planetary model, right? According to each, you have the nucleus and the electron is circulating around the nucleus. That Bohr posits, that model is false, right? In fact, the model was incompatible with electrodynamics. Bohr knew that because according to electrodynamics, the model would be highly unstable in a matter of seconds. The electron would just fall into the nucleus, given electrodynamics. So Bohr set up this model and said, well, that's not going to happen. Right, and he cook up some story about some transitional states and why electrodynamics would not apply over those things. Right now, the model was empirically successful. Right, you could derive the Balmer sequence out of it, and that's why people paid attention to the model. But in no way you can say that the model is true. Right, it's incompatible with a well-accepted theory of the time. So in order to represent the phenomena in more effective, computationally tractable ways, models often need to distort, simplify, abstract, or approximate the data. In fact, that's why they're so useful, right? Exactly because they simplify things, they abstract, then we can actually encode a fair bit of information about the phenomena in a sort of concise, salient way. But that also means that models fail to be true, right? They cannot be, therefore, a source of knowledge because they're not factive, right? Given all those elements. Now, perhaps models are factive not relative to the phenomena in the world, but regarding the abstract situations they in fact represent. Right? You may say, all right, fair enough. A model that represents, say, the Earth as perfectly spherical, which makes much easier any calculations about Newtonian mechanics about the Earth. So obviously are not true. The Earth is not perfectly spherical. So you say, look, fair enough. It's not true of the world as we know it, but it's true about this abstract reality, right? Namely, a perfectly spherical planet, right? So of that, it is true, right? Now, even granting that that's the case, it still would not be enough to yield the facticity needed for models to provide knowledge of the phenomena as found in the world. You say, okay, the model of a perfectly spherical Earth is true of a perfectly spherical planet. Fair enough. Problem is, it's still not true of the Earth because it is. The Earth is not perfectly spherical. And then, so that doesn't help with the truth and the facticity of the models relative to the phenomena we care about, namely the Earth, rather than some abstract object that is perfectly spherical. Note that none of the four rows of models that I identified earlier requires the truth of the models, right? The informational, the models can provide information even if that information is not correct. They can be sources of inference even if the models themselves are not true. So, for example, you can send a rocket to the moon using Newtonian calculations, so they make inferences from that, even though the theory and the model is not correct. You can have mappings over models of Newtonian mechanics, even though the models themselves are not true. And Newtonian physics can be presented as a family of models and have an expressive role, even though the theory itself is not true, that the models are not true. So the four rows I've identified before that do not require the truth of the models, right? The facticity is not a demand on that. Now, this gives a sense of why I don't think that models are a source of knowledge. Well, therefore, not a source of modal knowledge, right? Because modal knowledge also require such facticity. Now, there are views, as I mentioned in the introduction, that emphasize that models are crucial to the epistemology of modality. If you want to know what's possible or what's necessary, you need to rely on models. So according to Bob Fischer's book, Modality Through Theories, he offers a theory-based epistemology of modality, right? So he offers a justification of what's possible or what's necessary via theories, right? The TEM, theory-based epistemology of modality. As he notes in the book, a person is justified in believing in an interesting modal claim, P, if and only if she's justified in believing a theory according to which the claim is true, and she believes the claim on the basis of that theory. And finally, she has no defeaters for her belief that the claim is the case, right? So he's offering here an account of justification of a modal claim on the basis of believing that a certain theory that makes P true, right? And believing the claim on the basis of that theory for which there is no defeaters. Since following the semantic approach, a theory is presented as a family of models, then models become central to the epistemology of modality, right? Because here we have a way of being justifying having a modal claim on the basis of believing in a theory, which is in turn a family of models. So it's a belief in models that offer the justification of a modal claim on this view. Now, Fischer doesn't claim that his account provides a complete epistemology of modality, right? Rather, he says it offers the standard to which to hold interesting modal claims. Right? So it's more of a standard, so a minimal requirement that we take for interesting modal claims to be the case. Fischer also doesn't claim that we should believe, right, his account of the theory-based epistemology of modality. If the account fares well on the theoretical virtues, then we should accept it. We should be willing to employ it as a premise in our reasoning, whether theoretical or practical, in any domain to which it might apply, with the goal of attaining knowledge, right? So he's just sort of giving a kind of pragmatist take, right? So say, look, you don't need to believe that the account here is true. We can just accept it, right? A distinction that also von Frasen makes between acceptance and belief. Right? Oh, he cares, okay, accept the account, that is, take it as useful in theoretical and practical roles, right? We don't have to believe that the account is true. Note here, however, the important role played by theoretical virtues, right? Particularly, Fischer highlights implicit and conservativeness in the proposal. Right? Because it's on the basis of the fact that the account fares well on the theoretical virtues, right? Simple, conservative, that give us reason to accept the account in question. As example, consider the following illustration. This is a particular modal claim. Is it possible for a liquid to have the properties of a gas, right? The answer is affirmative, since it follows from a theory of supercritical fluids that a fluid whose temperature and pressure is above its critical point, but whose pressure is below what's required to compress into a solid, can be so that there is no distinction between liquid and gas phases. So here's a situation in which a liquid has properties of a gas, right? So it is this supercritical fluid in a special state, right? The temperature and the pressure are above the critical point, but the pressure is below what's required for compression into a solid. So in that case, you have a liquid that behaves like gas, right? So in that case, the fluid can go through porous solids, just like a gas do. Of course, in those specific states for that specific supercritical fluid. Finally, according to Fischer, we should understand modal epistemologies as competing explanatory hypotheses. And we should use inference to the best explanation to decide between them. And so the idea here is, well, we know the possibility of a liquid having properties of a gas because of a set theory that we allow us to explain and accommodate the behavior of those supercritical fluids, and we accept that theory on the basis of inference to the best explanation. Now, here's some concerns, right? Despite some attractive features of the proposal, especially I think its non-dogmatic character, I think the view faces significant difficulties. First, it relies on theoretical virtues, right? Simplicity and conservativeness. But such virtues need not be true conducive, right? And to be fair, Fischer acknowledges that that's the case. That means that your models and the theories you rely on can be false, even though they may exhibit the theoretical virtues in question. Right? If you think about Newtonian physics, right, it satisfied all theoretical virtues. The theory is simple, it's conservative, it's unified, right? It actually connected for the first time since ancient Greece the physics of the Earth with astronomy and the physics of moving planets. You have novel predictions, like the prediction of Neptune, that was discovered on the basis of Newtonian calculations. The theory is simple, right? We have four principles that characterize it, right? It's conservative. So it has all the possible virtues you want. Despite that, the theory is false, right? It predicts, there's no way that we can reconcile the theory with the perihelion of Mercury, for example, right? The point in which Mercury is closest to the sun. So the only way of accommodating that is by giving up the theory and allowing for relativistic effects. In fact, one of the most beautiful papers that Einstein wrote was exactly showing how the perihelion of Mercury drops out naturally from the relativistic equations, right? The sun is such a massive body that it changes the curvature of space-time around it, and thus the orbit of Mercury and the point that is nearest the sun has a kind of a bump in it. You cannot get that from Newtonian physics, right? So the theory is false, despite the fact that it illustrates all theoretical virtues you may want to want. So the point is, you should not rely on theoretical virtues if the goal is to obtain knowledge, since there is no guarantee that this goal will be reached, right? If you want knowledge, you need, as we saw, facticity. But theoretical virtues then do not guarantee the truth conduciveness of those things that satisfy the theoretical virtues. So there's no guarantee that via models or theories we can obtain the relevant knowledge. Second problem. The approach that Fischer offers also relies on inference to the best explanation. But inference to the best explanation need not be truth conducive either. The best explanation may still be false, since it can be part of a bad lot of possible explanations, all of which are far from the truth, right? So suppose we have 5 explanations that we are considering, right? And we consider all 5 of them, and we say, okay, we infer that explanation 5 is the best one, right? The best one of those available. But suppose that the truth is actually down the road, right? And 1,017,000, right? So we are really far off, even though we have here what is the best explanation. So you may have something that is the best explanation, but it's be completely false. The example of Newtonian mechanics illustrates that, right? If you consider the entire history of physics, Newtonian mechanics provides arguably the best explanation for physical phenomena that there was, much better than Cartesian physics, than Aristotelian physics, and so on. Still that is false, right? So using inference to the best explanation, again, it's not truth conducive. So we cannot have knowledge out of that because of the facticity of knowledge. Now, a different approach that also relies on models insists that modality itself is a feature of models rather than of the world. And this is a view that Basil Fraassen defended, right, a part of his defense of constructive empiricism. I'm an empiricist. I think there's a lot to be said on constructive empiricism, but I want to also articulate a form of empiricism that is importantly different from the form of empiricism that von Fraassen defends. Right? Here's what he tells us in the scientific image. Guided by the scientific theories we accept, we freely use modal locutions in our language. Some are easily explicated. If I say that it's impossible to observe a muon directly or to melt gold at room temperature, this is because no counterpart to such events can be found in any model of the science I accept. So here's him saying, right, if something's impossible to observe, that means because there's no counterpart of those events found in the models of the science that I accept. So he's locating the impossibilities in the models themselves. But our language is much subtler and richer than that. Its modal locutions reflect the fact that in the models of our theories, we see structures that correspond to alternative course of events, not all of which could be jointly actualized. So the models would posit things that go beyond what can be true, or at least can be actualized. On the view of acceptance of theories, which I have advocated under the name of constructive empiricism, Frasen continues, it does not require belief that all significant aspects of models have corresponding counterparts in reality. This applies to many aspects discussed by philosophers of science: space-time, elementary particles, fields, and finally, alternative possible states and courses of events. The locus of possibility is in the model, not a reality behind the phenomenon. So, this is the expression of the crucial idea behind constructive empiricism, that it's in the model that the possibility lies, that there are no real modalities in nature, right? So the model may include possibilities, but those are features of the model that need not correspond to anything beyond the model itself, right? So that's a central feature from Fraasen's view, right? And he gives an illustration of this with the color spectrum. So let us close, he says, with an example of how the logical structure of a language can be determined by an accepted theory. Wittgenstein's familiar example of the color spectrum as a logical space. A person uses a language in which he asserts such sentences as X is green, X is not red, Y is red. Nothing that is green is red. There is no possible object which is both green and red. Right? So these are claims that a person makes about colors relative to a certain logical space. And when Frasen comments, sentences of type 1, right, X is green, X not red, it has been trained or conditioned to a certain experiential conditions, right? So you see something green and you say, well, that object is green. Sentence of type 2 still express assertions which are merely about what's actually the case, right? Nothing that is green is red, right? You haven't never seen something that is both green and red. But 3, he says, goes well beyond that. He says something like, there could not be something which is both red and green, right? So now we're making a claim about an impossibility. So we went beyond our experiences, on his view, we went beyond what is actual. And then he continues, the explanation is that this person is guided by his idea of a simple abstract structure, the color spectrum. We can think of these as a line segment or an interval of real numbers, the wavelengths. He associates with each color predicate. Note here what Frasen does something, a sort of sleight of hand very quickly, right? He understands wavelengths in terms of their mathematical representation, right? In terms of, there'll be particular functions and values within an interval of real numbers, right? Now, of course, there is a mathematical representation of wavelengths in the model, but it's important to understand that what this stands for are behavior, wave-like behaviors in the world, right? And that's what the mathematics is meant to represent, right? So it's important not to confuse the two things, right? Okay. He continues, he associates with each color predicate, such as green, a part of that spectrum. So he associates within the model the connection. He associates disjoint parts with red and green. And when he says that an object is green or red, he's classifying it, that is, assigning it a location in the spectrum. So sentence 2 amounts to no occupied location belongs at once to the parts associated with red and green, so nothing's both red and green. While 3 says which says that it's impossible, right? Nothing could be both red and green, says that no point of the spectrum at all belongs to both parts, right? So he's then distinguishing the modality here as a claim about the entirety of the logical space, right? So there is no point in the logical space in which red and green belong to those parts. Whereas a claim about actuality, nothing's red and green, is just a claim about the occupied regions of the space. That's how Prof is then reading modality as features in the model. It will be clear how the logical connections among sentences in this language are determined by the structure of the color spectrum. Blatantly modal sentences, such as 3 that says that nothing could be both red and green all over, do occur. But this person evaluates them as true or false by reflection on the structure of the spectrum that guides all uses of color terms. That is, the person is evaluating modal claims in terms of what holds in the model, right, of the color spectrum that the person has. His linguistic commitments can be summed up by referring to his use of this spectrum. His theory of color consists in the family of models, each of which is a classification of objects through location in this spectrum. Right? So this is the way in which von Frasen is saying, look, what's possible, it's possible in the model. Right? He understands wavelengths as identify wavelengths with their mathematical representations within the model, and then understand the predicates, color predicates, as locations in the model relative to those mathematical representations of wavelengths. Now, this is an approach that makes models the locus of possibility in order to insist that there is no real modality in nature. That's what von Frasen is really after. As he says, to be an empiricist is to withhold belief in anything that goes beyond the actual observable phenomena and to recognize no objective modality in nature. So this is very important for the form of empiricism von Frasen has, that there to deny that there is such objective modality in nature. As we're going to see, I'm going to resist exactly that. I think you can be an empiricist without denying that there are objective modalities in nature. In fact, I think that's what modality is. But a model, this view, simply codifies information about the world. The model itself cannot be the source of that information. After all, as will become clear, what one aims to accommodate and explain are the phenomena in the world. The model is just a resource invoked in this task. So I think what's going on here is that von Frasen is sort of, in the attempt to maintain and space to deny the role for models, or deny for roles for modality, right? He is depriving the phenomena that we're trying to understand in the first place. In the color spectrum, if no point of the spectrum belongs to the parts associated with red and green, this is because there is no overlap among the wavelengths in the world of the corresponding colors. So once we realize that wavelengths is now ambiguous, right? One thing is the representation of wavelengths in the model, which is what von Frasen is doing. But what is this wavelength a representation of? I want to say it's a representation of waves. Right, in the world. And those features are what account for why is it that red and green never overlap? Because these are features of the waves in the world, right? It's the lack of overlap among the wavelengths of colors in the world that grounds the corresponding lack of points overlap red and green in the model, rather than the other way around. So the possibilities encoded in the model express modal relations among the objects in the world. So this is the point that von Frasen wants to deny. But then the worry is that you're denying the very phenomena you're trying to understand, right? Why is it that in the model, red and green do not overlap? Well, because in the world, the corresponding wavelengths, the physical ones that we are trying to understand, do not overlap themselves. right? So because they have modal properties themselves, it's not possible for the wavelengths of red to overlap with the wavelength of green because they have different wavelengths. And if you change the wavelength, you end up with a different color. That's why it's impossible to do that. This already indicates the way I'm thinking about the empiricist modalism, right? Now, empiricists since Hume have been skeptical about modality as an objective feature of the world. And von Frasen follows this trend, right? Now, remember, Hume said, look, I can observe a ball hitting another ball, a billiard ball hitting another ball and move it, right? So I can observe their motions. But where is the necessity, he asks, right? That once one ball hits another, then the other one is going to move. I cannot observe the necessity, Hume says. So there's no such modality. There's no necessary connection between the motion of one ball and the motion of the other. And since then, right, empiricists have been trying to avoid any commitment to modality as an objective feature of the world, right? But mind you, Hume also said that if you blink your eyes and you stare yourself at the mirror, you don't know that you're looking at yourself anymore, right? Because, well, what's the connection between what you're seeing before and what you're seeing now? For all you know, some other thing may be right there reflecting that image in front of you, right? But there's no self, right? We have no access to a continuous self. And so the worry here, and the problem, I think, is the following. Hume, and with him von Frasen as well, have a ridiculously impoverished understanding of experience, right? Experience is just this sort of circumstantial, temporally discrete event. That's all there is to experience. If you understand experience in that such a diminished way, indeed, it's very hard to see how you can observe connections in the world. Right? In fact, it's how can you even observe yourself and recognize that it's yourself that you're still observing after blinking your eyes. I think the problem here is with the understanding of what is experience is. Right? And what I want to offer is a broader understanding of experience. Experience is a little richer than what Hume and von Frasen is acknowledging. But once you have a richer understanding of experience, you'll be able to acknowledge that there are indeed objective modal facts, but those can be understood in ways that are perfectly compatible with an empiricist view. Right? So the concern here is that by accepting modal features in the world, one be embracing a problematic metaphysics that outstrips the boundaries of experience and hence of experience. Right? That's what Hume is worried about, and eventually von Frasen is as well. This would indeed be the case if the modal were understood as what is true in certain possible worlds, or what holds in certain abstract structures, or what is expressed by certain propositions, all of which provide additional metaphysical accounts to what is possible or necessary. So what I want to say is I think the mistake is understanding the modal in terms of something that is known modal. Is this attempt to offer a reductive account of modality. So, okay, what's possible is what's true in some worlds. What's possible is what holds in some abstract structure or a certain what's true in some propositions, right? All of those things try to account for the modal in some other terms. All of those terms are problematic, metaphysically speaking, right? Because how do we have access to possible worlds or abstract structures or propositions, right? So what I want to say is these are ways in which we are adding a philosophical gloss on top of something that is much simpler than the philosophical gloss that is being added to it. We are interested, when we're interested in modal epistemology, we're interested in what's possible and in what's necessary. We are not interested in what it holds in a world right? Or in an abstract structure, or in set abstract propositions. Those are extraneous things, right? We're interested in what's possible, what's necessary, what's contingent. So let's not add a gloss, a philosophical gloss that add a bunch of problematic abstract objects or inaccessible objects like worlds or abstract structures to understand the modal, right? Let's realize that the modal is something that it's actually primitive, right? Why? Because even those who try to reduce the modal to the non-modal end up assuming, despite their wishes, assuming something that is primitively modal. I'll give an example. Right, David Lewis, in his modal realism, right, he says that there is a plurality of worlds. Right, Lewis would understand, from Leibniz and others, that if something is possible, that means that it's true in some world. There is a world that is just like ours, in the sense that it's a maximally connected spatio-temporal region, in which, so if something is true, there is a world in which that claim is true, right? So if it's possible that, if it's the case I could have been a dentist, for example, rather than a philosopher, that means that there is a world in which a counterpart of me is indeed a dentist, right? Now, if I'm interested, concerned, is it possible that I run 100 miles, right, non-stop, right? If you say, well, there is a world where a counterpart of you run 100 miles, that doesn't help, right? I want to know if I can do it, not whether there's some counterpart of me able to do it, right? Or counterpart that I don't even have access to. Now, Lewis insists that whichever way the world could be, there is a world that is that way, right? So he populates a logical space then with all these worlds. But there is the question, however, how does he know that indeed there are no impossibilities in a possible world, right? So if you say, well, because then it would not be a possible world, right? Well, but that means that we already have some grip on what a possible world is, right? So that we can add it to the logical space. Which means that once you have the logical space, the very structure of the logical space has already a modal structure, right? Namely, it requires that only what's possible is in it. But that notion of what's possible is now not tied to a world, because that concerns the very structure of the logical space itself. And that means that there is some primitive notion of modality, even for Lewis, for the possible world's logical space should be available. That's what a modalist would insist, right? That we need modalities too basic. We cannot explain it or account it in some other terms. So we might as well embrace it, right? But if you embrace the modality as a primitive, you don't need to have a gloss adding problematic abstract objects or possible worlds, or you name it, in terms of as a way of expressing what the modal is. That's what I'm suggesting that an empiricist modalist will do, right? Resist the reification of the modal in terms of metaphysically problematic notions such as possible worlds, abstract structures or propositions, right? There is no need to add a layer of metaphysical interpretations to the modal. Certain properties, which are here understood as features of objects, rather than in terms of universals or some other abstract objects, go together, right? Others are ruled out. That's how we figure out why certain things are possible, others are not, right? So I want to say that, yeah, there are objects in the world. These objects have properties right? Some are green, some are red. Those are properties of things. We need to understand these properties, just as we should not understand the modal in terms of possible world. We should not understand properties here also as in terms of universals or some abstract objects. If you do that, we're going to make the same mistake again, right? Understand properties in this minimal sense, right? Just as features of things, right? In a way that ordinarily we understand. When I say that this table I'm sitting at is fragile, right? That's a property that the table has, given the material constitution, right? Given the materials that it makes, that is made of. I don't need an account of universals, an account of abstract objects to say what these properties are, right? I can see the properties in question, right? So resist the temptation of adding a metaphysical gloss on the modal. Resist the temptation of adding a metaphysical gloss on properties, right? And understand that on this view, then, there are modal properties, right? The table I'm sitting in has one of them, right? Certain things go together, other things are ruled out. Those are just facts about the way the world that we live in is. So a fluid whose temperature and pressure is above its critical point, but whose pressure is below what's required to compress it into a solid, is such that it's possible that there is no distinction between liquid and gas phases for that fluid. Now, this is a modal property of the fluid. It's not a matter of a theory. It's a matter of identifying the property in the world, identifying it as a property that those fluids have, right? And those things are identified by interacting with those fluids, examining their properties, controlling the environment, and seeing what kinds of features they have. So it's a modal property that the fluid has. As opposed to Fischer's account, we don't need a theory of supercritical fluids to detect the modal properties of such fluids. We just need the fluids and their modal properties, right? We test them empirically to determine what those properties are. The relevant modal properties provide a justification for modal knowledge rather than a theory. So rather than going into one level up, use the theory to justify the modal properties. I say, look, don't need to go into the theory. Just study the properties of the object and infer out of the modal properties of the object what kind of modal knowledge you can or cannot have about the object. After all, that's what we're interested in, right? We're interested in the object, rather than the theory of the object. The wavelength associated with red and the wavelength associated with green do not overlap. And they cannot overlap without shifting to a different color. Right? Understanding here the wavelength, that the wavelength in the world, right, associated with our experiences of green things and red things. Now, those wavelengths, if they were to shift, they would change the color, right? So one is longer than the other. So if you change one into the other, you change the color. So that's why they cannot overlap, because then we change the color. That's why it's impossible, given the features of the world, that something be both red and green all over. It's not a feature of the model. The model codifies that information. But it's just a feature of the modal features of the objects in the world, right? So as opposed to von Fraassen's account, the color spectrum, the model, expresses this fact. It's not, nor could it be, its source. So the proposal here, I will insist, is a form of empiricism, since we can detect, and in many instances, see the relevant modal properties. Right? So if I see that the table I'm sitting at right now is fragile, right? It can be broken if enough weight is added to it, right? It's kind of wobbly. So by pressuring the table, it wobbles. I see the table's fragility. So I'm actually seeing a modal property. I see the table. I touch it. I can see the fragility of the table. I see that it's not a lot of pressure is needed to break it, I can reach the mug. I know it. Since I see that all I need to do is to stretch my arms to reach the mug, right, upon the Schrodinger makes, right? So I'm now seeing a possibility, right? So we're able to see some modal facts. Using a prism, I can see a beam of light be decomposed into light of different wavelengths. Red and green are wide apart in the prism. They couldn't overlap without becoming a different color altogether. I'm seeing that by seeing the prism. Using supercritical fluid chromatography, I can see the separation of certain fluids and experience fluids for which liquid and gas phases are not distinct. And so sometimes what we see is mediated by some instruments because we cannot see with the naked eye, right? But via some instruments, we can see, and those instruments extend, at least some of them, not all, but some of them would extend the epistemic axis that we have, because the instruments have themselves the same properties that our visual experiences have, right? They are counterfactually dependent on the scene before them, right? Just as our vision is counterfactually dependent on the scene before our eyes. So because both satisfy these counterfactual dependence relations, they give us visual information, right? We can refine the access to the objects. The axis is robust. So it has the epistemic properties that we want from vision. So we can see some modality. Of course, there are lots of things that we cannot, modal properties we cannot see, right? So I think I can see, when the Hume's example, right? I can see the one billiard ball hitting another one. I can see the one cause the other to move. So I can see some causal connections. I cannot see all of them. For example, there's very good evidence that smoking causes cancer. Now, I cannot see that process, right? Because it takes a very long time to unfold. So I am unable to see that causal process. But we can see other things, right? So if you look at the lung of a deceased person who smoked for decades and compare with the lung of someone who did not, you can see the difference. One is gray, the other is red, right? So it makes a big difference in this respect. So the proposal here is also a form of modalism, since the modal properties of objects are taken to be primitive. They are not to be explained in some more basic terms, such as possible worlds, universals, or abstract objects. So I'm saying, look, objects have modal properties, and the modal properties are primitive. So you cannot explain that in terms of possible worlds, universal, or abstract objects, because all of those accounts ultimately presuppose some modality, despite their best efforts to do that. So you might as well embrace a primitive modal features. However, there's no need to invoke theoretical virtues or inference to the best explanation in this account, since the reasoning involved is not typically based on theories. And when it does invoke theories, the justification for the modal knowledge is offered by the modal properties of the objects in question. So we're inferring what we know by exploring the modal properties of the things we're trying to understand, right? Not by inferring out of a theory, using inference to the best explanation. On this view, modals provide auxiliary resources in our reasoning about the world for informational, inferential, mapping, and expressive purposes. But our modal knowledge, to the extent that we have it, goes to the modal properties of things, right? So modals play the role that they play, the four roles that I identified early in the talk. But modal knowledge is knowledge of the relevant properties, where properties, again, is understood in this non-metaphysical way, just as features of things. Of course, far more needs to be said about all of those things, right? And I'll say more about those things in the context of a particular exploration of quantum mechanics next week. But I hope enough here has been said to suggest that we have here an interesting and significant form of empiricism, right? It involves a richer sense of experience that allows us to experience modal properties. But of course, also, as with a good empiricist, it avoids metaphysics, right? Or at least some metaphysics, right? Like possible worlds, abstract objects, propositions, universals, which I think are reasons why empiricists justifiably try to resist modality in the past, because that's how modality has been understood. If we don't understand modality in these metaphysically inflationary ways, there's no reason why we should shy away from modal properties of things in the world. That's the kind of empiricist modalism that I'm suggesting. And tonight, that's what I have to say in terms of laying out why I think this is a view worth exploring further. And I'll be more than happy to discuss further those questions with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good talk. Very good talk. Now, it's time for Professor Zhang Lifeng to comment, to do some comments and ask questions.
Okay. Thanks to Professor Bueno for the wonderful speech. Now it's my comments time. There will be 3 parts in my schedule. I will first summarize the talk, and second, I will raise some questions. At the same time, I will make some comments on the talk. Finally, I will give the opportunity to the audience if it has any questions. So before my summarization, a reminder: due to the difficulty to distinguish the pronunciation of model and the pronunciation of model, I will have to use the word modality instead of model. So I say modality knowledge rather than model knowledge. Okay? Okay. So first, I will summarize Professor Bueno's talk briefly. Some people think that modalities are features of models. Modality knowledge should thus emerge from model knowledge. But Professor Bueno denies that models are the source of modality knowledge. In this talk, he actually holds that modality knowledge is a consequence of knowledge of objects' properties, while models only encode relevant information about the model. Models play an auxiliary role in helping people infer information about objects and consideration. With models as a useful device, people ultimately get access to objects and their properties, which are the grounds of our modality knowledge. Professor Bueno goes on to show some troubles about viewing models as source of knowledge. Since models are not true or even not true act, models are not fit for the source of knowledge, in his opinion. After that, Professor Bueno turns to theory-based epistemology of modality, which is defended by Bob Fischer. According to TEM, a person believes a modality claim on the basis of a theory, which is presented as a family of models. But Professor Bueno argues that TEM, theory-based epistemology of modality relies on implausible principles in that they are not truth conducive. Therefore, Chen is not a reliable approach to modality knowledge. And next, Professor Bueno discusses another approach advocated by Fraassen. According to that approach, models are the locus of possibility, and there is no objective modality in nature. In contrast, Professor Bueno claims that a model codifies information about the world and hence cannot be the source of information. Particularly, the possibilities encoded in the model express modality relations among the objects in the world. Instead, Professor Bueno proposes an empiricist modalism. In the fluid case, he insists that it is the fluid's relevant modal properties that ground our modality knowledge, rather than the theory or the family of models. Similarly, in the color case, it is the modality nature of wavelength that provides the justification for modality knowledge, whereas color spectrum only expresses the fact. The proposal is a form of empiricism. Since objects' modal properties can be detected in many cases, it is also a form of modalism, since Professor Bueno takes modal properties to be primitive. So that's the short summary of Professor Bueno's talk. And second, I will raise two questions, and at the same time, I will make some comments on the talk. Okay, so I will have to show, in order for the speaker and the audience to follow my questions and comments well, I will have to show my slides, okay? So this is my, wait a minute, I have to share my slides. This one. Okay, can you guys see that? Okay, I will raise two questions. And the first question is on the empiricist aspect of Professor Bueno's proposal. My question is, in what sense is the proposal empirical? I will use the example Professor Bueno uses in the talk. I know that the table is fragile, but it seems to me that I don't obtain the model knowledge in an empirical way, at least not in a traditionally empirical way. I don't see the property of fragile. Usually, I know it is fragile through a true counterfactual conditional. The true counterfactual conditional is alpha. I will show the sentence. Alpha is, if enough weight were added to the table, it would be broken. But I don't know the truth of alpha in terms of present or past evidence. According to Tim Williamson, I know that truth through offline imagination. But offline imagination does not seem to be a paradigm of perception. Besides, even if we obtain model knowledge posteriorly, we still need the help of a priori model principles. For example, we don't know that water is necessarily H2O in virtue of the chemistry discovery that water is H2O alone. We also need the a priori principle, that is, the necessity of molecular structure. So knowledge of metaphysical modality appears more than merely empiricist. So this is my first question. And my second question is on the modalitist aspect of Professor Bueno's proposal. Because Professor Bueno says that his proposal has two forms. The first form is empiricism. The second form is modalism. So my second question is on the modalist aspect. I'm worried that in what sense are modal properties primitive? Do you mean that they are not analyzable or reducible to any other stuff? It seems to me that modal properties are compound, and any modal property has at least two components. For example, I say something instantiates a necessary property if and only if it instantiates the property. This is an empirical fact, and whatever instantiates the property necessarily instantiates it. This is a priori modal principle. So, in my opinion, a modal property is definable, which seems to imply that it is not primitive, at least in the conceptual sense. If we insist on the primitiveness of modal properties, I think it must lie in the modal principles behind modal properties. Say, we claim that beta, water is necessarily H2O. The primitiveness of the modal property necessarily H2O should rely on the irreducibility of a modal principle, gamma. The principle gamma is what has necessarily whatever molecular structure it actually does. So being a priori principle, gamma, the principle, is not logically analyzable, even though we could paraphrase gamma in terms of possible words. Given its actual molecular structure, water has that structure in all the possible words in which there is water. But according to Professor Bueno, possible word semantics is not the source of modality. I think possible word semantics is also not a tool of definition, but a useful tool of explanation or illustration. So those are my two questions and my comments on your proposal. I'm waiting for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang. These are wonderful comments. I thought you summarized the paper beautifully and clearly and effectively. And your two questions are indeed go to the heart of the matter.
张立峰，把你的这个退出去。
好，稍等，我都不太会弄这个。OK.
Yes. Okay.
So I really appreciate the questions and the comments that you make, and I think they both go to the heart of the matter, right? And so let me say a few things about them. So the first one, you're concerned that to what extent my account is indeed empirical, right? And you were concerned that any knowledge that I may have, say, for example, the fragility of this table, ultimately will depend on some counterfactuals, for example, right? So you gave the example, if enough weight were added to the table, it would broken, right? And then you note that in Williamson's account, he says, well, this is known via offline imagination, right? Now, I want to resist that, right? So I don't think imagination can play any role in modal knowledge, because imagination is itself not factive, right? I can imagine all kinds of things, including impossible things, right? So I could imagine, becoming a fried egg, right? But I cannot become a fried egg according to essentialism. But I can imagine those things. So the fact that we can imagine something doesn't doesn't mean that we have the corresponding knowledge, because imagination is not constrained in ways that ensure the facticity of what we imagine, right? So I want to resist the kind of Williamson line about the role of offline imagination, right? If I know that this table is fragile, it's not because I'm imagining something. I know this table is fragile because I know that the object is made of, has some properties, right? Well, it's this one that I'm sitting at. I don't know about yours, but mine is, this very cheap wood, right? That, again, I have knowledge about the actuality, right? I know behavior of wood materials, right? I know that if this elephant were to sit here, it would just break it, given the kind of resistance that it would be able to offer. So I want to say that my knowledge of the fragility here is based on the knowing of the properties of the table and its constituents, rather than of imagining something, right? Of course, I'm able to imagine something because I have that knowledge. And I think that's a trade-off that Williamson is making when he says, well, we're going into this offline imagination. What's going on there is we are relying on a bunch of information that we have about the modal properties of the objects, and then considering scenarios in which the relevant thing would happen, right? Now, the fact that we use counterfactuals in doing that, of course, I don't think it's a problem because, as you know, I think we can see modal things, right? And so I don't think that outstrips empiricism in and of itself. But of course, I'm offering a broader understanding of experience than what the empiricists, the traditional empiricists, has offered. So I'd like to resist the need for imagination here, right? And I want to say, this is empirical in the sense that it's relying on our empirical information about the relevant objects whose possibilities we are now considering, right? So that's the my take on that the first very appropriate question. Oh, you also mentioned the case of H2O, right, and the necessity of H2O that would rely on a priori modal principles. Here, I think we need to be very careful because it's very easy for us to just blend in with a traditional philosophical discourse on those matters, right? So I want to know, do we really know that H2O is necessarily, that water is necessarily H2O? I want to say that knowledge relies on essentialism. So you need to know, well, look, it's an essential property of water is that it is, aggregates of H2O molecules. And I want to say, well, that relies on the idea that water has these essential properties. It wouldn't be water unless it had those features, right? But how do we know that there are those essences in the first place? How do we know the truth of essentialism? Because without the truth of essentialism, I don't think we can, it doesn't follow that water is necessarily H2O. We rely on a fairly contentious metaphysical view about modality in this case, or about metaphysics more broadly. And it's not clear to me that we know that essentialism is true, or at least we need some independent arguments to this effect. So my take here is that I don't think I need to invoke this a priori modal principle, because it's not even clear to me that we have the corresponding knowledge about the necessity here of water, right? Because it does rely on a contentious metaphysical view, essentialism. So I want to question whether we do have that kind of modal knowledge. So part of the view here is, of course, as a good empiricist, I'm going to examine how far modal knowledge goes. My claim is, I think we as philosophers tend to overstand what we think we actually know in terms of modal knowledge. I think we have less modal knowledge than we think we do if we press things carefully enough on this empiricist view. So that's why I don't think we need to rely here on a sort of a priori modal principles, right? Okay, so, but that's a very, I think, a very pointed and important question. Now, your second question then addresses directly the issue about modalism, right? And in what sense they are primitive, right? You offer an interesting and make a very interesting point. You say, look, we can analyze those properties, and then you say, well, something instantiates a necessary property provided that instantiate the property, and whatever instantiates the property necessarily instantiates it.
That's
right?
my point. Yeah.
But what's interesting here is note that first, this is not a reductive account of modality because it presupposes the necessary instantiation. And it's exactly what the modalism says. We cannot explain what a primitive modality is without invoking some modal notions, right? So that's exactly the mark of a primitive notion. I'll give you another primitive notion, identity, right? You may say, oh, no, we can't define identity in second-order logic, right? A is identical to B, provided that for every property P, if A has that property, B also has it, and vice versa. Well, I define identity here, right? Well, have you? Note that when you talk about X equals Y, right? It has to be the same X and Y on the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the bicondition, right? So you need to be talking about the same things on both kinds. So you presuppose in the notion of identity in order to express a principle that allegedly defines identity. So that's an indication of how the account is circular. It presupposes the very notion that is trying to define. And I think the nice example that you offer as a way of trying to characterize what will be a necessary property illustrates that.
Yes.
Right? It invokes that necessity. Of course, I would resist formulating in terms of instantiation, because I think instantiation invites us to think about universals. Right? It invites you to think, okay, look, we have these extra things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And that they are now being instantiated here. And I said, well, look, I want to resist. Maybe there are those things, maybe there aren't. I want to resist that we need to posit them, right? In order to understand the model. So, and then we noted, so the modal principle that water is necessarily H2O, right? So then you point out the primitiveness of this modal property, right? And say, well, we should rely on the irreducible modal principle that water has necessarily whatever molecule.
Yes.
It actually does.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you with the modalism aspect of your proposal, but I'm trying to understand which is exactly primitive, because I think the primitive is the notion of modal principle. That is, whatever water has necessarily whatever he actually does have. This is my point. I agree with you that I'm supporting the doctrine of modalism, because possible semantics is just a tool, just models. Yeah, they are not the source of modality.
Right.
So, yeah.
No, we are on the same page. I agree with you. We can explore possible worlds as a tool. As
just the models and structures, yeah.
Exactly, we can do that, of course.
Yeah.
I agree. Now I see your work. You say, okay, well, what is exactly necessary? What is
primitive? Primitive, yeah.
Right. It's just that the issue is the principle expresses a role for modality, right? It expresses, in that case, that the necessity is applied to the molecular structure.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's one role, but it's not the only role, because you may have a necessity that might be not a feature of an object, right? But maybe a feature of a relation among things, right? So, for example, if you have entangled states in quantum mechanics, when you set up a system, it has spin up, you set up, prepare it, and you have another system with spin down, so that whenever one has spin up, the other has spin down, and they are correlated that way. So you have a system that is entangled. Now we have a necessity, but it's now a necessity over a relation, right?
Yes.
Rather than over an object. So my point would be, there's some primitive necessities that are needed. But what they will show up is slightly differently depending on the objects that we are considering. Sometimes it's a primitive of the properties of the object. Sometimes it's a primitives about the relations among those objects.
Yes, actually, I'm thinking that maybe modality lies in the primitive of the model principle objects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the right of right?
Yes.
What? So, because my worry is when you do that, we are moving back to language, as though the properties, the modal property is now a property of a certain linguistic construction, or a property of a certain model. And I think, well, this is just a way of expressing a modal property about something that we are interested. So if you put that as a feature of the principle, you're just going back to linguistic things.
You think it's a linguistic property?
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to resist, because I think those are properties of things rather than of our ways of describing them.
Yes,
and of course, Frasen wants them to be properties of models, of our ways of describing. But I think that misses what they are, right? Just as I think possible worlds misses what are interesting, what's possible, right? And I'm not interested in what's going on in some other world.
Yes. I'm just I understand your view. The point is that I'm trying to express that the necessity lies in the principles or the laws. We see Newton mechanics is necessary, so we see the law or something like that is necessary. Not the object is necessary, but the laws or the laws are universal and necessary. In this sense, I see it's primitive.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Well, okay. I'm not sure I would say that Newtonian physics is necessary, right? Because it's false.
Yes, it's false. Yeah.
So it cannot be necessary if it doesn't even hold in general, right? But I see your point, right? So in that case, let's suppose that it were necessary, right? And let's suppose they say, look, now there are two different ways you can think about that. You may say, look, is the necessity in the object? So, for example, I have my water bottle here.
Yeah.
If I drop it, it will fall, right?
Yeah.
And so, is the fact that it will fall necessarily, right? Let's suppose that it is a necessity. Is this a property of this bottle, or is this a property of the law, right, that regulate all bottles and all objects on Earth? Where do I put the necessity, right?
Yeah.
So now, some people would say, well, this is a property of the law, right? It's the law that's necessary. And then you have just a particular instance, right? My bottle is subject to the law, that's how it falls, because necessarily...
It's only an instance of the law,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's one way. Another way is to say the following. there are no laws. There are regularities, empirical regularities in the world, right? And things are connected in that way. Now, this object here has some properties. It has mass.
Yeah.
Because it has mass, rather than, for example, the number 2 that has no mass, it's subject to relations with other objects. And it's out of those relations that will force this thing here to fall, right? So not because there is a law acting on it, but because those things, this bottle and the earth, are in a relation with one another.
Okay, I know.
And that's what makes it fall. So instead of putting the necessity in the law, you put in the object out of relation.
At bottom is the necessity is the property of objects. This is your point? And at the bottom. Okay, I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, at least that's a way of reading. Of course, I don't want to say that there are necessities in this case because I think Newtonian physics, there's no gravity in the way that Newtonian physics assesses.
Sorry to interrupt. I suggest leave some time to other audience.
Okay.
Stop it. You too.
Thank you so much. Those are wonderful comments. I really appreciate it.
The audience have any questions?
Okay. Who?
I think that fellow has a question.
来长open your长生来do you open your okay you don't open your phone. We don't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay, right.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Chen. But I thought Dr. Fang raised his hand firstly, so probably we can let him to ask his questions.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lai. So thank you, Professor Bueno, for your talk. And I think I have a question about, so on your view, is it possible to make a distinction between metaphysical and nomological modalities? So initially, I was thinking maybe we can appeal to the distinction between essential properties and non-essential properties to do that. But as you just said, you don't want to rely on essentialism. So now I'm wondering whether if there is some other way to distinguish the two kinds of modalities, or you just want to reject the distinction completely. So that's my question.
Thank you. That's a great question. And you're quite right. Part of the empiricism here is to press some concerns and some metaphysical views, right? So I think the distinction between metaphysical and nomological modality, of course, requires the recognition that there are laws, right, to begin with. So, and some, of course, traditionally people would say, yeah, look, some truths hold what they are in virtue of the objects, even though there are no laws about those objects. Others rely on laws, specific laws, and then you get the nomological features, right? Now, it turns out that I'm skeptical about the existence of laws, right? And on that, I think Frasen is right. I think laws is a way of regifying and giving a metaphysical gloss that goes beyond what's actually needed in the sciences. I think empirical regularities are enough to do the work that scientists actually need, they don't need to add this necessity that it's the actual gloss that metaphysicians will have on laws. And so I would, it's given that I don't think there are laws, I don't think there is a distinction here to be made between metaphysical and nomological necessities. Of course, conceptually, we can make that distinction in the way that I just made, right? So, okay, if there were laws, okay, then the distinction would be drawn in terms of effects that would happen in virtue of the laws holding and those that do not, right? So, so for example, again, assuming essentialism and so on, I could say, I'm necessarily human, given the kind of being that I am. But it's not a law of nature that I am human, right? In fact, it's a contingent fact about myself that I happen to be made that way, right? Maybe essentialism wouldn't say even that much, but there might be truths of me assuming essentialism. There are metaphysical truths, but they need not be nomological ones, right? Of course, there are nomological truths that I'm subject to, right? On that view, right? So I cannot fly unaided to China, even though I would love to just go there and see you all guys now, but I couldn't do that unaided, right? And that's a nomological necessity on that view. I think I can understand that without positing loss, right? Because I think, the fact that I'm unable to fly unaided to China is a fact about me, right? Given the body I have, given the features that the way I'm connected to the world, right? If I try to fly, I would just fall down, right? But I don't need a law to that. I just need regularities. And that's something that we can observe, right? Again and again, right? So that's the way I would pose that. But it's a very good question. It's a fair question to ask as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. Who else? Someone else?
Zhang Lai has a question.
Lai, yeah.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Professor Bueno, for your wonderful talk. It's quite informative, and I learned a lot from it. And I have a question for your argument at the very beginning of your talk, and it's about your argument that the models cannot be the sources of knowledge, and because you thought the sources of knowledge has to be factive, and you used the memory as an example, arguing that the memory is a source of knowledge, at least partly because memory is factive. But my concern is that maybe many philosophers of memory might disagree. Because, for example, like some simulationists, like Koch-Michelin, and they would argue that episodic memories are typically not factive. And that is because they see memories as just a mere cognitive process, and they find that factive and illusory memories are just the same product of the very same cognitive process. So, and they even hold that remembering is just imagining the past. So probably will say that episodic memories are not factive, but nevertheless, they can still be the sources of memory, of course. And besides, one reason you provided why models are non-factive is that models would have to simplify or abstract or approximate the data. And it strikes me that we might, in the same way, conclude that semantic memories are also non-factive in this sense. And that is because our semantic memories, or what maybe fuzzy trace theorists will call gist memories, they will also have to simplify or abstract or approximate the past events. So maybe there's probably, I don't know, maybe there's some ambiguity in the concept of activity here, and maybe I missed some important parts of the talk, but that would be grateful to hear a response. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. That's also a great question, and you're exactly right. So there are understandings of memory in which memory is not factive, and in many ways, we all know that memory can be misleading. Right? We misremember certain things. Sometimes we do combine with imagination, and we're sort of combining things we experience with things that we thought or imagined that it happened. And of course, whenever that happened, memory cannot be a source of knowledge, right? Because at that point, any more than imagination is. So those forms of memory are not factive, and they are not knowledge. They're not sources of knowledge, right? Others are, right? So, for example, you remember the time of today's talk, if you didn't remember that, and thought that actually it was 5 p.m. rather than 7 p.m., you would show too early, right? Or if you thought that the talk would be on Friday rather than Thursday, you may show too late. Now, the fact that you remember that indicates, well, that piece of memory was actually effective, right? And because you remember it, you could be here. Now, of course, this is a very simple thing. And memory is very good for those things, right? Even there, of course, sometimes you're misled, right? Suppose you have a tradition of having Friday talks rather than Thursday talks. And then you just forgot that this talk is actually on Thursday, right? So sometimes that happens. But the point would be, for memory to be a source of knowledge, it would have to be effective. Some portions of our memory are indeed effective. Others are not, right? So, for example, can you tell what you had for breakfast on May 19, 2020, right? Maybe you can if you have a booklet, marking everything you eat, or maybe you can because you have absolutely every day the same thing for breakfast, right? But or you never have breakfast. So, but if not in those cases, I would say, we just don't know, right? You can imagine, all right, or maybe on that day you remember because it was a special day. Maybe it was you celebrate breakfast with your mom and something like that. So you may have some other reason to recall. But of course, sometimes memory is not going to be a source of knowledge. But when it is, it has to be effective. And that's my point, right? I fully agree with your point. I really like Kirk and Michelin's work, and I think the examples he brings, of course, are illustrations about the complexity of memory, the richness of it, but also it makes memories move away from their epistemic role, right? They acquire a different role, right? So they acquire about something about ourselves. Why is it that I remember that way? Why is it that my memory is conflated with some imaginations? Maybe that tells us something about my wishes of what had happened rather than what in fact had happened, right? And that's telling because that also tells often ways in which our memories can deceive us rather than give us information. If you're able to identify, right, the contribution of these non-epistemic factors, you can actually learn something about yourself, right, along the way. In fact, that's what psychoanalysis does, right? Invite us to explore those contents that may not be fully conscious, but are shaping some of our responses. And we learn something about ourselves by considering and reflecting about those contents, right, as they appear in memory, right? So, but this is done in a way that doesn't, at that point, it's not the content of the memory that is giving the information, right? It's not something about what we make of that content, right? That is not relevant. But you're quite right. So I agree with the point.
Thank you for clarification. That's very helpful.
Yes, okay. 朱敏吧，卓一朱 ，open your camera, video, to ask question directly to Professor. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bruno. I have a question. Since my English is not very well, I'm wondering if our experience is a kind of direct sense, which is direct to some fact, such as touching or watching an object. So how could that kind of direct sense is possible to connect with those modal phrases like possible or necessary? I think unless there are some imaginations under this modal verse. For example, I know my desk is fragile and I hit it, and I feel that, or I imagine that, or it is possible that it will be broken. So I think there is some underlying model structure doing work in it. I don't know what Professor Bruno thinks about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a great question too, right? So, I think the thought here is, for example, suppose I press the wall at my house, right? And I press it very hard, and I feel that it resists, right? And no matter how strongly I press it, it doesn't move, it doesn't bulge, right? So I can feel the solidity of the wall. So, and I literally experience the impossibility of me moving it away in a way that I can move my laptop, right? So look, I'm just doing it right now, right? So, and I'm seeing the mobility of my laptop. I'm actually experiencing it. As I'm experiencing when I try to press the wall of my house, the impossibility of me pushing it away. So in that sense, I'm actually having the experience. I'm not imagining something, right? I'm feeling it. Just as here I'm experiencing the mobility of my computer by actually moving it, right? I'm experiencing a modal property. I'm also experiencing a modal property of being unable, or the impossibility of moving the wall further, right? Of course, I can imagine that I couldn't, but in this case, I'm seeing something, right? I'm not saying that every modal property is like that, right? There are modal properties of things that I don't have access to. They're too small to be seen, too far away, right? So I cannot see so, for example, I mentioned the relation, right, of coupling in the an entangled state into quantum objects, either ups and down, right? I cannot literally see those things; they are too small to be seen, right? But I'm experiencing them mediated with the results from the preparation of the systems that I have, right? So I think it's a detectable modal property, perhaps, but not one that I could see, right? And others that are just way beyond the scope, right? I cannot see the smoking causing the cancer in a person's lung, right? That takes too long. That's a process that we just we cannot see that. We see the results, right? And then we infer something about the process, but we cannot literally observe these causal processes. So some modal relations, I think we can see. Others we can infer out of things that we can see. Others we infer out of theoretical considerations that we have, right? But the fact that at least some, I think, we can observe, at least ground in what sense they are empiricists, right? Empiricistically acceptable, right? I just want to try to resist the need for imagination in this process, because imagination, I think, because it's non-factive, I don't see how it can be a source of modal knowledge, because we can imagine even impossible things, right? I'm not sure if I answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your response. It's very helpful. But just
go ahead.
Yeah. I don't think. I just think that since when we feeling something or we have some sense, then we will have some words, some imagination, or something then to get some claim. It's just like that. It will be, the desk will be broken, just like that. Yeah.
Right, but then the question is this. Are we having the relevant knowledge because of what we imagine? Or are we having the relevant modal knowledge because of knowing some facts about the objects that would ground whatever we imagine? Because then I would say it's the knowledge of those facts about the objects that is actually supporting whatever we're imagining. But then the imagining is not doing the work. Is what we are relying on to imagine, right? Because for example, you may say, oh no, look, I can move the wall in my house because I can imagine, being as strong as Superman, right? And then I'll just push it forward. In fact, I'll lift the entire house, right, and fly away. So, okay, I can imagine that. That doesn't mean that's possible. Right? Because that imagining involves assigning modal properties that I lack, right? Far more strength than I actually have. So that's why I would say we need to rely on the modal properties of the objects, as the objects are. Otherwise, we might be very misled into thinking that, certain things are possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
May I ask a last? I take the advantage of the chair. I ask a good last question. Maybe we can perceive the possibility of things, but I think we cannot perceive the necessity of things. As Hume says, necessity is beyond the scope of our sensory experience. We can perceive the fragility of glass. You see, I put this in the ground. Then they will be broken. I can't say this, but I cannot say this. If I threw the glass in the hard stone, then it necessarily broken. I just sense one instance. Necessary means everywhere. This is my question. Okay.
Right. No, that's a very fair question. I agree with you that establishing or seeing the possibility of certain things, it's much easier to do and much more plausible. But I still want to say that even in some cases, we can see the necessity, at least in the sense of impossibilities, right? When I push the wall of my house, I can feel the impossibility of the wall moving. Right? Because it doesn't matter how strong I press it, it doesn't budge, right? So, of course, it's impossibility about me, right, that I'm talking about. So I say, look, it's impossible that I move the walls of my house. And I'm seeing it by trying to push it and feeling that no matter how strongly I push it, nothing happens, right? So, and again, then I say, okay, I know the kind of strength I have, right? I know what the house is made of, right? And the kind of resistance that it can endure. Knowing that, I think I can safely say that, yeah, I'm seeing the impossibility. And I know because it doesn't matter whatever other conditions. It's not that I could make myself stronger by going to the gym and working out with the hope of one day pushing the wall away. And so, look, no, it's not going to happen, right? Not about me. Maybe Superman could do, but then that's someone else, right? So,
yes. Okay. Maybe the time is up. We have to close this lecture. Thank you very much, Professor How to pronounce your name?
Otávio. Otávio.
Otávio.
Otávio Bueno.
Bueno. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, thanks to Professor Bueno for your very informative and insightful talk. Very interesting, very good. Also, thanks to Professor Zhang Lifeng for your very good question and the insightful comments. And also thank Dr. Fan Da, Mr. Lai Changshen, Dr. Zhu Min for a very good question. And we have very good discussion. Let's expect next lecture of Professor Bell. See all of you on next Thursday night. Don't forget that. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all. This was a wonderful discussion, and thanks again for the comments. And it was really stimulating. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you all next
Very
week.
good.
See you next week.
Bye-bye. Okay.